Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Caitlin Bassat, and I am the Kamloops Youth Facilitator with the Invasive Species Council of BC. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for the final Invasive Species Action Month webinar Wednesday. This week, we're focusing on the Don't Let It Loose program. During today's webinar, we are joined by Martina Beck. She will share information about priority invasive species, provincial and federal regulations, and how to be a responsible pet and plant owner to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species into BC's native ecosystems. I hope you all had a chance to sign in early, and if you're having any technical issues, just please write a note in the chat box, and our ISC BC technical support will send you a private chat. Also, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, just feel free to pop them into the chat window, and the host will answer any non-speaker related questions in the chat. Questions for Martina will be answered in the allotted question and answer time. And if we don't have enough time to address all the questions, we'll send the answers out in an email. To begin, we'd like to find out who is here and where you all work, or what areas of interest you have. If you haven't already, if you could just please pop that into the chat box. So you can put in your name, workplace, area of interest, and also where you're from, and then we can review those while I introduce Martina. Martina Beck is the Invasive Fauna Unit Head with the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy and oversees the terrestrial and aquatic invasive animal program within the ministry. Martina completed her graduate studies on the invasive ecology of the freshwater smallmouth bass in British Columbia lakes. She has been with the ministry since 2015 and is based out of Victoria. So at this point, I'll pass the mic over to you, Martina, and I hope everyone enjoys the webinar.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. And can you hear me okay?
Yes, Martina, we can hear you.
Great, so I'm just gonna share my presentation here. And just give me a second. Hopefully everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, and for the presentation itself, I'm actually going to just stop my video. I will resume it for the Q&A portion, but I'm just trying to limit any connectivity issues. And so thank you, Caitlin, for the opportunity to present today. I'm excited to be presenting as part of Invasive Species Action Month and to be talking about the important subject of Don't Let It Loose. Just bear with me as I try to get these forward. There we go. So for today's webinar, I'm going to start off by providing an overview of the importance of Don't Let It Loose and the applicable provincial and federal regulations in BC. And then I'm going to be talking about some specific pathways and species that we are concerned about here in BC. And then finish off by talking about what you can do to prevent pets and plants from being introduced into the wild, as well as resources that are available to learn more beyond what I talk about in today's webinar. So plants and animals that are not native to BC can become invasive if they are released into our ecosystems. These invasive species can harm our environment, economy, and society. Invasive species have been identified as the second largest threat to biodiversity after habitat loss. More specifically for today, I'm going to be focusing on pets that have either already been introduced into BC that we want to prevent from spreading into other parts of the province, as well as some species that haven't yet been introduced that we want to keep out of our province. I will briefly talk about some aquatic invasive plants. However, the Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development leads the invasive plant program. So I'll mostly be focusing on invasive animals for this webinar. Many species that are released into the wild can grow much larger in size than they would in a tank or pond, as you can see from the pictures of the goldfish in the picture below. And they can outcompete with our native species. This can include species that we really don't want to see moving freely in the wild. Not all species that are released will be able to survive in our climates, but they can still impact native species by introducing diseases and parasites when they're released. As an example, some of you may have heard about the red-bellied piranha that was caught in a lake near Nanaimo last fall. This tropical species is not known to be able to survive in our winter climates, but can still impact native species when they are released. And it was likely released as an unwanted aquarium pet. The picture in the top right left-hand corner is not actually from BC, it's from Florida, but snakes have been found to escape in BC as well. Prevention is key, as once these species are introduced and established, it is very costly and often difficult to eradicate them, and containment and management from further spread may be the only option in some cases. First, I wanted to talk about some provincial laws and regulations in BC that we have to address pathways for aquatic invasive species. And this includes under the Freshwater Fish Regulation of the Wildlife Act. It's prohibited to possess and transport live fish in BC without a permit or license. So movement of live fish between water bodies is prohibited. As well, the use of live bait is prohibited in BC. Specifically, the use of finfish, dead or alive, is prohibited throughout the province. There are some specific exceptions and more specific bait bans in effect for some waters, so it's important to check the local fishing regulations before going out on the water. There are also several different pieces of legislation relating to invasive plants, but I don't have time to talk about all the specific legislation on today's webinar, but I will provide information about resources and where you can find out more information about all the various legislation at the end of the webinar. In addition to addressing pathways, there's also species prohibited in BC under the Controlled Alien Species Regulation, which has designated approximately 1,200 species as being prohibited to possess, breed, ship, or release in BC without a permit. This list includes a wide range of species from cheetahs and anacondas to invasive mussels. But for today, I want to focus on species that are listed under Schedule 3 of the regulation, which are fish species that are commonly sold as aquarium pets. And examples of this include species such as the western mosquito fish, tench, and white cloud mountain minnow. And I'll also be providing some additional examples of some species under this prohibition a little later in the webinar. In addition, we have an identification guide to help distinguish these prohibited fish species. And this guide helps to distinguish how you can identify these prohibited species. So when you're going to purchase an aquarium fish, you know whether it's a prohibited species in BC. And I'll talk about how to access, again, these resources towards the end. In addition to provincial legislation, there's also important federal legislation applicable in BC under the Aquatic Invasive Species Regulation, the Fisheries Act. Under the federal AIS regulation, it's illegal to introduce an aquatic species into a body of water where it's not native, unless authorized under provincial laws through appropriate permitting. For additional information about this federal AIS regulation, I encourage you to visit the DFO website. Now I'm going to move into focusing on some key pathways as well as some specific examples of species that we are of particular concern that fall under the Don't Let It Loose messaging. Some aquarium pets, as I mentioned, don't have the survival skills to live beyond their tank or pond, but in some cases they may survive, reproduce, and spread, becoming aquatic invasive species. Even if your pet is native to the local environment, it should never be released as it may be carrying diseases or parasites. The first example that I'm going to talk about is probably one of the most globally well-known species when we think of an aquarium fish. But typically when we think of a goldfish, we think of a small fish from a fishbowl. However, when goldfish are released into the wild, they can establish and grow to very large sizes and up to 41 centimeters in length, as you can see from the photos. And as you can also see in the photos, they don't always appear golden-like in color. They can actually have quite a bit of color variation from the true golden to white and even brown or black. When released into the wild, goldfish can tolerate a wide range of temperatures and oxygen levels and are unaffected by ice cover. And as a result, we're seeing an increasing number of established populations in regions across the province, including the Lower Mainland, the Sea to Sky, Southern Interior, Cariboo, and most recently in the Skeena. When released into the wild, goldfish can compete with native fish species for food and habitat and even prey on our native fish species. They can cause increased water turbidity as they can disturb sediment while feeding, which can harm native aquatic plants. Control and eradication options can be very limited depending on the water body, as treatment options aren't species specific to just goldfish and will harm or kill native species and the ecosystem. Therefore, in some cases, once goldfish are introduced, they may not be safe. There may not be a safe and effective treatment option available, which is why it's critical that they aren't introduced in the first place. The next species that I wanted to talk about is the rosy red minnow, which is a species that's native to Eastern and Central North America, but has been introduced into BC. The rosy red minnow is a close variant of the fathead minnow and is commonly used as a feeder fish for larger aquarium fish and also used as live bait. The red minnow can actually be mistaken for goldfish due to their red coloration, as you can see in the photo on the bottom, but they don't get nearly as large as goldfish can in the wild and typically only reach up to about 10 centimeters in size. This species has the potential to compete with our native species such as suckers for food. They have been introduced into a series of small ponds just outside of Prince George, where there are concerns of potential downstream spread into the Fraser. Efforts there are being made to eradicate them through manual removal, through draining the pond, as well as using electroshocking to remove the rosy red minnows. Monitoring work is still ongoing to assess the effectiveness of those manual removal efforts. The next species I'm going to talk about is a rather strange eel-like looking species called the oriental weatherfish. And this is a popular aquarium fish that can actually frequently be sold in pet stores and online under a variety of different names, such as the weather loach, the dojo, or the golden dojo. The weatherfish can be mistaken for the larval ammoset stage of the native Pacific lamprey, but the oriental weatherfish has whisker-like barbels around its mouth, which you can kind of see in the picture on the top. This species is native to Asia, but they have been introduced into BC and are present in the Lower Mainland, and they can be commonly found in field ditches. When released into the wild, they can survive in a wide range of temperatures and even breathe air when oxygen levels are depleted. And they have the ability to reproduce rapidly. And when in high densities, they can reduce the diversity of aquatic insects where they're introduced. The oriental weatherfish is one of the prohibited species under the Controlled Alien Species Regulation, making it prohibited to possess, breed, release, or transport them in BC, which is why it's important to research before purchasing an aquarium fish. So next, I wanted to highlight some species that can be introduced by escaping or being released from backyard ponds or water gardens. And the first example is the red-eared slider. This species was originally not believed to be able to survive in BC's climates, but with recent increasing temperatures, it's now shown to be able to survive in southern parts of the province, including southern Vancouver Island, the Lower Mainland, and the southern interior. The invasive red-eared slider may be confused with the native western paden turtle, as they occupy similar habitats at the same time of year, which can include rivers, swamps, ponds, and ditches. The invasive slider, however, can be distinguished from the native painted turtle due to the presence of the red patch on the side of its head, as you can see in the photo here, as well as the presence of yellow stripes on the side of the head and neck, also visible in this photo. In addition, the underside of the invasive slider is yellow in color, while the native painted turtle has a red to orange colored underside. And lastly, the shell of the invasive slider is more dome-shaped, while the shell of the native painted turtle is more flat-shaped. The invasive slider has been known to carry diseases from the pet trade that can transfer to native turtles, and can be known carriers of salmonella that can be harmful to humans. And this is why we want to contain and prevent this species from further spreading into other parts of the province. And that's where we can see that it's currently present in British Columbia. And next, I wanted to talk about aquatic invasive plants that can spread from backyard ponds and water gardens. And this can occur if small amounts of water that contain plant fragments can spread into natural waterways and result in the introduction of aquatic invasive plants. Examples of some species that have been introduced into BC that are commonly sold for aquariums or water gardens includes the Brazilian Alodia, Eurasian water milfoil, parrot's feather, and yellow floating heart. These species can spread rapidly and impede the use of shallow waters for recreation, as you can see from the photo on the top, as well as cause impacts to irrigation and alter the natural ecosystem by causing algal blooms, as you can see from the photo on the bottom. As an example, Brazilian elodia, or also called the Brazilian waterweed, is thought to be one of the most universally available aquarium plants on the market. And at the end of the webinar, I'll talk about where you can get more information about additional aquatic and terrestrial invasive plants, as well as the applicable laws and regulations for these invasive plants in BC. Next, I wanted to quickly talk about a pathway that isn't always top of mind, which is one in which pets can be released into the wild, and that's through species that are commonly used as pets in classrooms, where they can accidentally escape or may be released without realizing that they're not native. An example of this is the walking stick insect that is commonly used as a classroom pet and has actually been found in the interior of BC and believed to have escaped from a nearby school. When introduced, as they have been in California, the walking stick insect can cause damages to gardens and native plants. This species is parthenogenic, which means they can produce young without mating. So it only takes a single female to produce a large population quite quickly. It's important to know that it's illegal to have stick insects as pets in BC without a permit or license. And I did also want to quickly talk about the biological supply trade, which has been identified as a potential pathway for the introduction of a number of crayfish species. As an example, the rusty crayfish has been introduced south of the border in Washington state, but has not yet been detected in BC. But when introduced, they can reach high densities and compete with juvenile fish for food. And this is an example of a species that we want to prevent from being released and introduced into BC. The next pathway that I wanted to talk about is species that can be intentionally released into the wild as part of the live food trade, which could be done as potential acts of compassion or mercy. This can be harmful to both the species released, as it may not survive in the new environment, or to native species if it does survive and become invasive. For example, the northern snakehead may have established its first invasive population in North America through a mercy release. The snakehead is an aggressive predator that can reach up to 100 centimeters in length. Snakeheads may be confused with native burbot to BC, but the snakehead lacks the whisker-like barbels that burbot have, and the snakehead only has one dorsal fin as opposed to 2 dorsal fins on the native burbot species. What makes the snakehead a successful invader when introduced is their ability to breathe air and survive out of water for long periods of time. Amazingly, in order to avoid drought or other harsh-like conditions, northern snakeheads have been found traveling over land in search of new habitats and burying deep into the mud or substrate to hibernate, which is pretty incredible and would be very strange to see. Snakeheads are not currently found in BC. However, in 2012, a snakehead was illegally introduced into a pond in Burnaby. Fortunately, the single fish was captured, but in other places where snakeheads have been introduced and established, they can outcompete with native species. There are over 30 species of snakeheads, all of which are prohibited to possess, breed, transport, or release under the Controlled Alien Species Regulation in BC. So once again, it's important to research species before purchasing. Another species that can be sold through live food trade is various species of crayfish. In BC, we have the native signal crayfish, but in 2018, the invasive red swamp crayfish was discovered in a pond near Richmond, which was the first detection of this species in BC. The red swamp crayfish can be distinguished from the native signal crayfish by the presence of red bumps that cover the claws, head, and mid-body segments. When introduced, the red swamp crayfish can displace native crayfish through transmission of diseases as well as competition for food. The red swamp crayfish has been introduced globally through a number of pathways, as I mentioned, through live food, but also through live bait, biological supply, and aquarium trade. So this species covers all the pathways that I've talked about so far. And next under this pathway, I wanted to talk about the Asian clam, which is believed to have been first introduced into North America in the late 1930s as a food source. Asian clams are also commonly sold for aquariums as they can be used for to control algal growth. And they can be sold under a variety of names, such as the pygmy or gold clam. The Asian clam can be distinguished from our native species by their small size, as they typically only reach about 2.5 centimeters in length. whereas our native species of mussels are typically several inches in size. The Asian clam tends to be yellow, green, or light brown in color, which is where they can often be referred to as the gold clam, and they do also have elevated growth rings. This species is self-fertilizing, so they can rapidly reproduce and reach high densities, which can cause clogging of water intake pipes and irrigation pipes. They are a filter feeder, and when they do reach those high densities, they can outcompete with native species by removing nutrients from the water. This species is now widespread throughout North America, including in our neighbors south of the border in Washington State. In BC, they have been introduced with confirmed populations in the Lower Mainland, which were first detected around 2008 in the Lower Fraser, Pitt, and Coquitlam rivers, and most recently discovered in Shuswap Lake last year. And last, I wanted to talk about how escapes or release of livestock or domestic pets can result in introduced populations on the landscape. I'm sure most of you have heard about feral pigs in the news over the last several months, which are becoming an increasing problem in some jurisdictions in North America. Feral pigs can escape from captivity or be released intentionally for hunting. And feral pigs can also go by many different names, such as feral swine, wild pig, wild boar, or feral hog. They can be descended from domesticated pigs, wild boar released for hunting, or a combination of both through interbreeding. Once introduced, feral pigs can reproduce quickly and live in a variety of different habitats. They can be disruptive to crops and private property by causing erosion and digging up roots. In addition, they prey upon livestock such as goats and sheep, and they can spread a large number of diseases and parasites. Within BC, feral pigs have been reported in low numbers in several regions, including the Peace and Chilcotin, but to date, feral pigs are not known to have established in large populations in the province. In addition, domestic pets such as rabbits can escape from backyard enclosures and can reproduce very rapidly when released into the wild and establish populations. So it's important to maintain fencing and backyard enclosures to prevent these escapes from happening. And now I wanted to focus on things that you can do to prevent your pets or plants from accidentally escaping or releasing into the wild. So as I mentioned, never release aquarium pets or plants into the wild, and this includes storm stewers. As well, never move live fish from one body of water to another. As I mentioned, it is legal in BC. As well, ensure that water gardens and ponds are contained with no chance of any species or water escaping into other water systems. Ensure any water released from aquariums, ponds, or gardens is done on land and away from household drains, sewers, or other bodies of water. All it takes is the release of a small amount of water that could contain small fragments of invasive plants for them to spread into the wild. As well, when gardening, be sure to select plants that are native to your region, and they will be more likely to thrive and are better for our native species such as bees and butterflies. And as I mentioned, ensure that fencing and enclosures are maintained to prevent the escape of livestock or domestic pets. And what are some things that you can do as a pet owner if you need to consider alternative homes or places for your pet? You can contact a friend or someone else to see if they can adopt your pet. This can be done through using social media or community lists. You can also contact your local pet store or the place where you originally purchased your pet to see if they're willing to take it back, as well as research other places that may be able to provide a new home for your pet, such as animal shelters, sanctuaries, zoos, aquariums, or other community organizations. As well as acting responsibly to research the pets and plants before buying or adopting them. Know how large they're going to get and how long they will live and how much work they will entail. Make sure you're willing to fully commit to their lifetime of care. If you see potential issues in caring for them long-term, consider an alternative, as well as knowing what pets and plants are legal to own. I've talked about some of the legislation applicable in BC, and shortly I'll talk about where you can find information about additional laws and regulations for BC. As well as know what you're purchasing. I mentioned that for a few species that they can be sold under a variety of different names. So it's important to research and know the species that you're purchasing and purchase from reputable retailers and species that are properly labeled. as well as ensuring that you have the appropriate permits or licenses required to either import, possess, or transport any pets or plants in BC. And as a last resort, if you need to look at ending ownership, you can contact a qualified veterinarian to euthanize your pet in a humane manner. For your aquarium fish, please don't flush them down the toilet, as this can spread diseases through our water systems. And for invasive and for plants, dry and freeze plants in a tightly sealed bag before throwing them in the trash, but do not compost them, as plant fragments and seeds can be spread through composting systems. And most importantly, always remember to report. If you see a species that you think could be introduced, take a photo and report it through our Provincial Invasive Species app. It's free to download by searching Report Invasives and includes pictures and information about a range of species to be on the lookout for. Reports get sent to our Provincial Invasive Species specialists, and anytime you can get a photo will really help with identification. And as I mentioned throughout the presentation, I now want to talk about some resources that we have available online. On the Interministry Invasive Species Working Group website, there's a number of resources. And the Interministry Invasive Species Working Group is the coordinating body for invasive species prevention and management within the Government of BC and has representation from all resource land management ministries. This working group works collaboratively with many partners and jurisdictions on invasive species prevention and management. As well, the working group is a lead for the Provincial Early Detection Rapid Response Program, and our provincial EDRR plan can be found online, along with a number of additional resources about invasive species laws and regulations, best management practices, as well as our provincial invasive species priority list, as well as our species alert sheets that I've been showing throughout the presentation. And there's additional alert sheets on a number of additional species available, all for download online. And once again, as I've talked about throughout the presentation, know the regulations and report. So I talked about reporting species that may be potentially invasive in BC, but it's also important to know how to report if you see a potentially unauthorized release of a species or unauthorized sale of species in BC. These should be reported through to the Report All Poachers and Polluters hotline, and these notifications go to our provincial conservation officers. In addition, under the freshwater fishing synopsis is the regulations that specify our bait regulations and specific bait bans that may be in effect in your local waters. So it's important to look at these fishing regulations before going out on the water. And as I mentioned previously, we have our identification guide to prohibited species listed under the Controlled Alien Species Regulation. So this identification guide includes important information on how to identify these prohibited species so that you can know before purchasing a species, either in a pet store or online. And with that, it now concludes the presentation portion. So I thank you, and I will pass it back to Caitlin to start the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Martina. That was a really great presentation. I definitely learned lots, and I'm excited to pass that information on to people I talk to. So we do have a couple of questions that we'll go through, and to all the participants, if you have questions, just pop them in the chat box, and we'll be happy to get to them as time permits. So I had a question which ties into Anna's question. I was curious if there's been any occurrences of red-eared sliders reproducing in BC, and Anna is wondering if red-eared sliders can interbreed with Western painted turtles.
I will have to check with our herpetofauna specialist about that. I'm not sure about the interbreeding with the native species, but I can certainly check up and maybe it can be shared as a follow-up through email. I don't know offhand, but I'll definitely follow up on that.
Awesome, thank you. The other question we had was from Kathy. She is wondering, can rosy reds and goldfish outcompete or cause problems for species at such as the western painted bull?
Sorry, your audio cut out there on that one. Can you hear me?
Martina, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. So we had a question from Kathy, and she was wondering if rosy reds and goldfish are sometimes causing problems by outcompeting species at risk, like the western painted turtle.
Yeah, so in BC, we haven't seen specific examples yet. It depends on the system and if they do overlap with a species at risk. Certainly, if they are in the same habitat, there is potential for them to outcompete with these species. So it's definitely a concern that and of course it can, if there's species at risk present in a system, it can affect what options you have for treatment and control, because of course we can't be harming our species at risk when we're looking to treat goldfish or rosy red minnow. So I don't have specific examples offhand, but it certainly is potential that they could outcompete our species at risk.
Perfect. And then I have another question myself. So if someone is out fishing and they happen to catch an invasive aquatic species, like say a goldfish, what should they do other than reporting it, of course?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's important depending on the species that you catch. So I would encourage you to check the fishing regulations before you go out. For an example, like the goldfish, you would want to keep it. Of course, confirming ID is important first, because there can be, as I mentioned, some lookalike species. So before you look at keeping it and disposing of it, making sure you're confirm the ID. But for some species that aren't native, such as smallmouth bass or yellow perch, there may be specific regulations around quotas and whether you can actually retain them or not. So just for species like smallmouth bass or yellow perch, it's important to check the fishing regulations. And once you're sure about AD, then for species like goldfish, you don't want to return them and dispose of them in, in the garbage, but not releasing them down any storm sewers or drains like that, because they could, if they're not fully disposed of, then they could potentially still spread back into systems.
Perfect, that's great. I'll definitely pass that information along, as well as I know a lot of people who like to fish, and I'd like to get out as well now that spring is here. We do have one last question. So you may not be able to answer this, Martina, and if not, we can definitely find a source for it. But Jay is wondering if there's any research on biological controls for Scotch broom.
It's a great question, and there is biological control work being done through the Ministry of Forests. I don't know the details of all the work and species that are involved with that, but I could certainly put Jay in touch with someone from the invasive plant program to give him more information about work that is happening on biological control.
Great. Well, thank you so much again, Martina, for the excellent presentation. So on behalf of the ISC and all the participants, thank you so much. Like I said, I learned lots, and I'm really excited to share this webinar with the volunteers that I meet with, because we're all virtual right now, and I have lots of other people view this webinar at a later date as well. So just for all participants, we'll be sending out a short link to an evaluation survey. So if you can please fill it out, your feedback is really appreciated. And it's also a great way for us to get ideas for future webinars. This is the last week of Invasive Species Action Month. So we still have our What's in My Backyard photo contest going on. So it's a great contest because all you need to do is go out and take photos of invasive species and make sure you report them using the Report Invasives app that Martina spoke about. And you can go to our website, which is bcinvasives.ca, and you can enter those photos, and place is a $350 gift card to Mountain Equipment. So thanks again for joining us, and make sure you check out our website for more information on BC's pet invasives and on the Don't Let It Loose program. And thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.